when I fell in love with his voice in a Spanish class at the University of Nebraska.
Speak louder, I want to hear what you're saying.
Some of you know Professor Shaffer. And for those of you who don't, you can find out more about him by reading his books or his essays on libertarian.com. Get acquainted with his ideas. He's been involved in libertarian thinking, thank you, for probably at least 60 years, and in libertarian activities as well. Butler retired last August from Southwestern School of Law, and after 38 years of having a captive listening audience, and for the first time in 72 years, he was without a job. He began to write papers when he was 9 years old. And I want to thank Giant for inviting me over to speak, because for the next 30 minutes, he has someone else to talk to other than me. And no matter what the topic is that he says he's going to talk about, he will talk about whatever he wants to talk about.
We were up here for this conference 2 years ago, and when it was over with on Sunday afternoon, Jane and Jayant and myself went to a restaurant to have a late lunch. And the waiter came up and asked, so what have you guys been doing on the weekend? And said, well, we had this conference on capitalism and morality. And he said, that was interesting. Did you have speakers on both sides? So anyway, I wanted to get into something that will probably take 3 or 4 hours if I really wanted to spend some time on it, and I know we don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to try and whiz through it. That's this idea that that I remember growing up with, the idea that the world is so complicated, the universe is so complicated, that it requires experts really to inform us of its nature and what we can do in terms of our behavior and our actions and so forth. And we saw this, I'm sure it came earlier than Plato, but that's, I think Plato's Philosopher King was the, maybe the first formal example of this kind of thinking. There are experts out there in the world who know more than we know. The world is too complex for you to know as much about it as you would need in order to function. And so we will have these Philosopher Kings available to help you. And this, of course, leads to the vertically structured top-down definitions and prescriptions of order. You're going to have order in the world. You've got to have it emanate from people who are sitting atop this pyramid, and that's always the structure that the Philosopher Kings insist upon. And they're at the top, and the rest of us are at the bottom. In the middle, of course, are the people who do the legwork for the Philosopher Kings. In our world today, be academicians, people in the news media, teachers, and so forth, that religious leaders who all confirm that model. Oh yes, you got to have someone in a position of authority to tell you about the nature of the world, the nature of whatever aspects of it you're concerned with, the nature of the universe. You'll be lost if you're simply on your own. And some earlier philosophers and scientists reinforced this. Newton's views on the science presumed that there was some body of understandable principles that experts, Philosopher Kings could understand and could grasp, but ordinary people probably could not. And so we end up with this universe of, can be taken down to reducible principles and small little building blocks of reality. Whatever the universe is made up of, it's made up of these small building blocks. And of course, later on, we discover the atom, and the atom fit in very nicely with that. It was just kind of like the bricks of the system that, the organization of the system we call the world. And we get into some of these ideas about the scientific method. I'm a great fan of the sciences, so please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am such a fan of the sciences that I also recognize their limitation. What is the value, from a scientific point of view, what's the value of a baby? How much is a baby worth? But years later, I ran across a very interesting book by an historian of the scientific process, Paul Feyerabend. Some of you may be familiar with him. Paul Feyerabend said, yes, there are all kinds of approaches to the sciences. The sciences have, scientific understanding has been fostered through a lot of means that are not what we think of as the scientific method. And he was of the view that anarchy was the way in which science should operate. Anything is wide open. And he started talking about the guesswork, the dreams, the fraud, accidents, things of that sort that have advanced scientific understanding. The accident of how penicillin was discovered, for example. And sometime thereafter, we got into that fun little side trip known as quantum physics. And quantum physics began upsetting this because we had the vision of the atom, and then people wanted to look inside the atom, and what did they find when they looked inside the atom? All of the many patterns of regularized order, right? Wrong. What we found was that there was a very interconnected but complex order within the atom that was maybe determined. Behavior may be determined, but it's not predictable. And when that thought begins to get into all of our minds, the whole pyramidal model begins to collapse. A universe that is determined, if we knew the position of every single molecule in the universe, we could predict, and we knew the velocity and the energy and all that, we could predict outcomes. Well, we know now that we cannot. We can't predict outcomes where we're dealing with complex systems. Complex system meaning 3 or more variables that are interacting. Still, the old paradigm continues to survive. We live in a world of experts. Governmental agencies are premised on the old model that if you take a look at any case book on administrative law, you will discover that the value of administrative agencies is that they hire experts, PhDs in economics, PhDs in physics, in chemistry, in biology, engineering, all of these other fields. And they're able to identify all of the factors, all of the variables that are at work in terms of having making it possible, let me put it that way, making it possible for administrative agencies to develop rules and regulations and so forth that will be consistent with these variables and thus produce economic order. I think, or social order, not just economic. I think the example of the central planning of economic systems is probably the clearest example of that. If we just turn all of this over to the experts on economics, they can straighten all of this out. This is a myth that still hasn't died out. I mean, we have Sanders, Bernie Sanders. He made such an impression on my mind, I forgot his name. The Vermont senator who said, "No, we need more socialism." Yeah, sure. That really worked the last time, didn't it? The time before that, and the time before that, and the time before that, and the time before that. But when you're dealing with people who are lost, who are confused, who have no philosophical center, well, why not? Let's try anything. And this kind of fed into, at least in my lifetime, some of the post-World War II thinking. Much of it about computers. Computers, it was said, President Eisenhower made the statement, there would probably only be a need for about 5 computers in the world. There were, Thomas Watson, president of IBM, said pretty much the same thing. There are only about 5 agencies in the world that could afford all of the equipment and so forth be necessary to put together one of these giant computers. Someone had suggested that that computer would have to be something about the size of Texas, and about a 12-story building the size of Texas, to handle all of the continued improvement in the processing of information. And of course this led to Orwell's novel 1984. You know, one of the big powerful forces that could afford these computers was the United States and Great Britain, probably the USSR, the Vatican. I've forgotten who the five were. They could afford this, and the rest of us would be at their mercy. They could surveil us, they could control, they could manage everything. And it got so bad that as early as the 1970s, there was one president of a computer manufacturing company who made the statement, "There will never be a computer in the home." 1970s. Well, sometime after that, I think it was, people in Japan began discovering miniaturization. And now, how many computers do I see in this room? And it's probably difficult to find any home in the world, well, I won't say in the world, any home, at least in Western culture, that doesn't have some form of a computer in it. It may not be a personal computer, may not be a laptop or a standard desk-sized computer, but watches, cameras, television sets, cars, ovens, whatever. So much of the technology that we have, so much of the apparatus that we play around with is premised upon a computerized regularity that comes from the computer premise. Well, we also got introduced to one of my favorite scientists, and that was Werner Heisenberg. Heisenberg introduced us to the uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle being that in any kind of an experiment, you're trying to determine both the location and the velocity of a particular molecule. You can't get information on both at the same time. In other words, in that situation, the observer becomes the observed, becomes part of the observed. And we see this as well in the scientist who might be wanting to, or just a housewife, house husband, I guess we better be precise here, who might want to test the temperature of a pan of boiling water. What do? They put the thermometer in. What do they do when they put a colder thermometer into a pan of hot water? Well, they reduce the temperature somewhat. The act of observing interferes with the act of observation. Well, along became Schrodinger, and Erwin Schrodinger, and I won't go into much detail on that because it'd take too long, and B, I'm not sure I understand it well enough to develop it, but it's kind of a play out on some of the notions that are inherent in quantum physics. But there is a joke about this. Some of you may have heard it, that Heisenberg and Schrodinger are driving down the highway in the car, and Heisenberg is driving, and Schrodinger is the passenger, and they get pulled over by a cop. The cop comes up to Heisenberg and says, "Do you know how fast you were driving?" And Heisenberg said, "No, but I know where I am." And so the cop says, "Well, all right, I want to go check the trunk of your car and see what you got in there." "Well, all right." So they goes back to the trunk and comes back and says, "Did you know there's a dead cat in your trunk?" Schrodinger says, "I do now." Anyway, about this time we get the creation of that one area that I have long held to be the source of the libertarian anarchist dream of a world that runs by itself, a world that runs on the basis of spontaneous order that is not directed by anyone. And that's a study of chaos. Chaos is one of these concepts that people confuse it. They think that the study of chaos means all hell is going to break loose and there's nothing you can do about it, so you might as well just bend over and take what's coming to you. I mentioned yesterday a cartoon that I liked on this. It was a newspaper cartoon, a comic strip cartoon. It was these two characters that were talking. One of them was trying to explain entropy to the other. It says, entropy is the belief that the entire world begins in an orderly condition and through entropic processes continues to erode into total disorder. And the other character says, it's nice to be on the winning side. One of the questions that I've had here is whether or not there really is such a thing as disorder. We talk about it. You know, something, so-and-so did something that created an active disorder, or something came along that surprised us, and so it was very disorderly. David Ehrenfeld, who teaches at Rutgers, wrote a book called The Arrogance of Humanism, which really predated popularity of chaos theory. And Ehrenfeld talks about how the humanistic premise that he was being critical of is one in which it's presumed by virtue of this top-down model that it's possible to anticipate any and every consequence of an action. And at the Huntsville nuclear power plant, they had undertaken this, and they had 3 or 4 backup systems for everything. It's like if this goes out, this will kick in, and if that goes out, this will kick in, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And there's nothing that could happen at that Huntsville, Alabama nuclear facility that could really surprise us. Well, one day some maintenance man was going through the air ducts in this facility, and he brought with him a lighted candle. Why a lighted candle instead of a flashlight, I don't know, but that's what he had. The lighted candle caught fire with, or set some the insulation material, I think it was, on fire. And you had a very serious fire there at Huntsville. It all but completely destroyed the facility. Well, this was something that, as Ehrenfeld points out, the presumption that we could anticipate the outcome of all kinds of otherwise unpredictable events was negated by the fact that nobody apparently thought that it would be possible for a maintenance man to be crawling through these tunnels with a lighted candle. Well, the entire universe really operates on this idea, the unpredictable nature of complex systems. You can see it in weather forecasts. Weather forecast for tomorrow, maybe even the next day, well enough to get you by. A week from now, forget it. We're going to have thunderstorms here in 10 days. No, you won't. Or you may or may not, but it won't be because they have any capacity for making that kind of a prediction. Back home, I had a woman running a stop sign. Fortunately, I was paying attention, and this gal just went right through a stop sign, but she was not paying no attention to what she was doing, because what she was doing also included putting mascara on her eyes, and I don't know if she was texting, but she might as well have. And she just went zipping right on through, and I was really tempted to chase this moron down, but I didn't. But if she had plowed into me, we could say, well, she created a condition of disorder. No, she didn't. She created a very bad situation for me. But there were consequences. If you run through a stop sign, putting your mascara on, you're not paying attention to all the variables out there that might lead you to have an accident with someone, that's part of the order. A more dramatic example was a person that you're all familiar with, I assume, Chesley Sullenberger. He was a U.S. Airways pilot who took off from LaGuardia Field there in New York, and shortly after getting off the ground, plowed into some geese, or they plowed into his plane, whatever it was, but they completely shut down all of the power on the plane. The engines were out. And Sullenberger knew it. What do? You're up there so high, and then you got absolutely zero power. And so he did what I suppose any intelligent pilot might do initially. He contacted some FAA guy in the area telling him the situation, and the FAA official said, well, maybe you can kind of limp over to this other field in New Jersey and land there. It's not all that far, and that'd probably be your best bet. Well, Sullenberger knew a couple things. First of all, he was an experienced pilot, and he could probably anticipate pretty much where this plane was going to go if he tried getting over to this airfield in New Jersey. But he was also a glider pilot. And Sullenberger knew that at that particular moment, he was now flying a glider. So, what does someone who's an experienced glider pilot, not only a glider pilot, but help to train people to fly gliders? What did he see as his options? Well, he could try what the FAA guy said and go over to New Jersey, but there's a good likelihood he's going to plow into apartment buildings and there'll be 300 or 400 dead people being talked about on the 6 o'clock news. And instead, he saw this nice, big, flat river beneath him, the Hudson River, and he knew that if a glider came in and landed appropriately as he knew how to land a glider, he'd probably prevent catastrophe, and that's exactly what he did. And some of you, did any of you remember this? Yeah, good, okay. The thing that was fun watching all of this on television was to see the response of other people. Afterwards, Hillary Clinton was out there. She was one of the first people out there to rescue people, right? Well, no. The guy from Homeland Security, he was there. I mean, that's his job. Well, no, he wasn't there either. Who were the first responders? Ferry boat operators. And they immediately saw, that plane just landed. We're not going to go over here to the New Jersey shore. I'm going to take a sharp left and go back here and help rescue these people. One of the ferry boat operators got his ferry boat underneath the tail of the plane and brought it up so that it would not sink and bring the plane down into icy waters more than it was. And there's this one photograph, I'm sure it's available someplace, but the plane and the water, and all around it were I don't know how many ferry boats getting people, rescuing people off this plane. Net result, nobody died. And Sullenberger was hailed as a hero. I don't think he was a hero. I think he was something better than that. You know, a hero's the guy who scores the winning touchdown for Podunk, you know, against Old Siwash and so forth. You know, anyone can do that. This was somebody who really behaved intelligently. And the other informal systems of order that arose immediately after this. Oops, plane on the water, okay, well, what happens next? All these ferry boats show up, okay. And when it was over with, the ferry boat operators went back to being ferry boat operators. This is probably, maybe the highlight of the lives of some of these people. I remember you. You were one of the guys who came to the rescue of that U.S. Airways. Yeah, I remember that, yeah. Well, the idea that we can regulate, plan for, carry out physical consequences of behavior is now understood to be simply a fallacy. Governments cannot create workable economic systems. The best they can do is just get out of the way. It's like raising children. What's the best way to raise children? Get out of their way. Just leave them alone. They'll figure it out. If you doubt that, try directing your bodily functions sometime, consciously. Consciously direct your bodily functions. I guarantee you'll probably be dead in about 2 minutes. Well, actually you won't, because your system will override your stupidity and you will end up having, no, you're supposed to have a heartbeat or whatever it is here. We're going to do that because you're too dumb to realize that that's what you should have done 3 seconds ago. This idea has been carried out in a number of cities in Europe, some in New Zealand, where towns have done away with all traffic laws. All traffic laws. Speed limits, stop signs, the whole bit. They just don't have them anymore. So you come to a busy intersection and there's a car here. So what do you suppose happens? You're going to have a lot of accidents, right? People are going to plow into each other. No. What has been discovered in these towns is that the accident rate across the board averages about a 50% reduction. It's because people are paying attention to what they're doing. Oh, Reuters had a series of articles on that some time ago, and they interviewed some people who lived in these towns. And what was your response to it? And a few of these people said basically the same thing. There was something nice about coming to an intersection where you had to stop, and the order was premised on you and that other driver getting in contact with one another. It's like, okay, you go ahead. And even though this is a person I didn't know, it was a person I was probably never going to have any contact with again. Oh, he's my buddy. I've had that feeling out on the freeways here in California. Somebody wants to cut into the lane that you're driving in, or you want to cut into their lane, and you do this kind of signaling. Once you've done that, I've had the feeling there's nothing that guy could do short of intentionally trying to run me off the road or something. There's probably nothing he could do that would detract from this relationship we've now established. He's my buddy. I don't even know who he is, but he's my buddy. He let me in and so forth. This is the way we behave. One of the most common questions I get from people is, hey, has there ever been a place on the planet where anarchy has ever worked? I said, yeah, every day. Every day, every one of you functions as an anarchist. You're doing it right now. I don't see anybody, well, Rick maybe. No, I don't see anybody with a gun. I don't see anybody threatening people. I don't see anyone forcing you to display a passport or do any of these other things. You're behaving peacefully. And that's the way we are until we manage to get ourselves organized. Once we get ourselves organized, and here you get into the psychology of what it means to get organized, which means basically to be collectivized. And led me to conclude many years ago that civilizations are created by individuals. Go back and ask about the origins of Western civilization. Who do you come up with? You come up with names of specific persons, don't you? They are destroyed by collectives. When did a collective ever create great works of art or poetry or inventions or anything else? They didn't. And right now, I'm cutting through to a lot of conclusions I would like to spend more time with, and I know Jayanta's going to yank me off the stage here if I try it. But I think we're in the fourth stage of the information revolution, which proceeded from the creation of language to Gutenberg's wonderful invention to the creation of the understanding of higher orders of mathematics, and now into the phase that we are really sticking our feet into, and I don't even know what to call it. But for years we have had this sense, I remember having it as when I was growing up, that it was the role of parents and grandparents to instruct children and grandchildren, right? How many of you learned to operate computers through your children or grandchildren? Myself, yeah. These are the people that are going to be the future, because they're going to be operating under the chaos principle that complex systems cannot be run from the top down. Get over it. We're seeing a bunch of bozos in, well, I shouldn't say that, I don't want to upset Walter's presentation this afternoon, but or later this morning. But the people who want to occupy the White House in America, as though that's going to be a position of authority to accomplish wonderful things. We're going to make the world great again. Right? Well, the nice part of it is that when your children, your grandchildren, I've got 5 grandchildren, I have sort of a suspicion that by the time my grandchildren are, in middle age, they will kind of figured out a lot of this stuff. They and a lot of other people. But we're not going to be saved by all the experts, Philosopher Kings and people like that. We're going to be saved by geeks and nerds. We're going to be saved by individuals pursuing their own self-interest, not by collectives. Anyhow.
one question.
From anyone but Jane?
My friend Paul, who is also very much into complexity.
You know, I like that kind of thing. But one of the things that fascinates me with chaos theory, although I don't know too much about it, but is called the Great Attractors. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
The which?
The Great Attractors.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And in a nutshell, if you put one of those cannons that fires tennis balls, if you point towards the ceiling there and the tennis balls have ink, it will put a dot there and a dot there. But after firing 1,000,000 balls, you will see that there are certain areas that will have painted weather balls. And that's a physical world where we're lucky. Anarchy works perhaps because in the physical world there are great attractors. In the intellectual world, you expect people here to behave in a certain way, to wait for you, there are great attractors in people's behavior as well. I wonder if you comment on that, tying with what you're...
Let me just respond to that very quickly, because it's a good point. If we behaved in our daily lives the way political systems behave, we couldn't hold a job, we wouldn't have any friends, people would not do business with us. You try going into a grocery store and behave with, like, I'm going to pull my 45 here, you're going to get out of the way so I can get through the checkout stand faster. You know, all kinds of negative things would happen. They had security guards with your picture and said, don't let this guy in anymore. And you're right, and these attractors show up in a variety of ways. Hospitals, for example, are attractors for disease. You want to get sick, go to a hospital. That's where all the people who have these illnesses, diseases, and so forth, they're in this hospital, and where would you think you would have a better chance of picking up a disease? Estate sales are attractors for antique dealers. You know, a baseball stadium is an attractor for baseball fans. You know, if you go to a baseball game and think you're going to be watching a bullfight, you know, you probably went to the wrong stadium. But you're right, and it's in our one-on-one dealings with each other, we're really pretty decent. We're decent among our friends, we're decent at the workplace, we're decent out in the marketplace. But if we start behaving in some sort of a collective manner, the way political systems do, in those settings, we wouldn't have any more friends, we would be fired from our work, and so forth. So it's an interesting question to ask ourselves. Why do we think we have to live with these coercive, violent systems if on a one-on-one basis we don't? So anyway.